Okay. Well, I'd like to start by thanking Kurt Hersey for inviting me here for this talk, as well as to the visit to his class earlier today. In that class, we talked about a chapter from my book, Electric Dreams, which is a cultural history of personal computers. In that book, to try to understand how we have come to think the way we have about computers, I turned largely to science fictional representations, from The Murderous Howl of Clark and Kubrick's 2001, to the mind-blowing cyberspace of William Gibson's Neuromancer, to the Orwellian Big Brother of Apple's commercial introducing the Macintosh during the 1984 Super Bowl. Why did I turn to science fiction? Well, because that's where the computers are. Very few romantic comedies have been made about computers, the notable exceptions being the Hepburn and Tracy classic Desk Set, as well as the unfortunate AOL spin-off You've Got Mail. It's no surprise. Historically, science fiction has been the genre where artists and audiences go to imagine and make sense of new technological possibilities, from space travel to artificial life to global warming. But something's changed in the last few years. When I began my research in the 1990s, science fiction was in a boom period. The cyberpunk movement of the 1980s had revitalized the genre, and by the mid-1990s, the internet explosion confirmed the status of writers like Gibson, Neil Stephenson, and Bruce Sterling as prophets of new technology. On television, the Star Trek franchise blanketed the airwaves, while the X-Files reinvented sci-fi suspense. And in 1999, the huge success of the first Matrix movie promised to usher in the most exciting science fiction universe since Star Wars. Of course, 1999 was also the year that George Lucas himself returned with The Phantom Menace, which, while commercially successful, did suggest that creatively the franchise was running out of steam. In any case, by the dawn of the new millennium, something was beginning to shift. In the spring of 2000, the NASDAQ stock market crashed, marking the end of the dot-com boom. On TV, the supernatural world of Buffy the Vampire Slayer was fast replacing Star Trek and the X-Files as fans' #1 cult show. And then, in Christmas of 2001, two new film series debuted which would come to dominate the decade's box office charts. The Lord of the Rings, and I apologize, a couple of images it looks like the heads are cut off, but I think you get the point, and Harry Potter. Together, the 8 films so far released from the two series have so far grossed over $7 billion worldwide, and all are among the top 20 grossing movies of all time. Here's a list of, you can see there's Titanic at the top, but just fantasy after fantasy after fantasy. If you throw in Shrek and the Pirates of the Caribbean franchises, in fact, 12 of the top 20 all-time worldwide grossers are fantasy films. Today, in retrospect, the success of those first two movies in Christmas 2001, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, and Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, seem like a no-brainer. Both films were based on best-selling books loved by millions of readers. They were high-profile, big-budget, tentpole pictures distributed by one of the biggest media companies in the world, AOL Time Warner, now just Time Warner. And they had the crossover appeal to draw in both adults and children, men and women, during the high-volume Christmas movie season. But at the time, the success of these movies was by no means a sure thing. Historically, fantasy has been a marginal movie genre, with not nearly the crossover success of its cousin science fiction. While 1939's Wizard of Oz, whoops, let's find Wizard of Oz. Sorry about that. There, oh, sorry. Well, there's the feet of Wizard of Oz. Is of course one of the most beloved films of all time, so beloved that you can just look at this blurry image and get the picture. Its longtime success lies less in its initial box office than in the fact that CBS in the 1950s began rerunning it every year during the Christmas season, turning it into a family viewing institution. The history of fantasy film is filled with high-profile flops, from Ralph Bakshi's version of Lord of the Rings. That was Hollywood's first attempt to make a movie of Lord of the Rings, an animated version from 1978, to Willow, George Lucas's clumsy attempt to do for fantasy what he'd done for science fiction with Star Wars, to Legend, which was Ridley Scott's clumsy attempt to do for fantasy what he'd done with Blade Runner. Hollywood's conventional wisdom of the time said that fantasy was bad box office, expensive, esoteric, and too unrealistic for adult viewers. The most successful fantasy filmmakers had been animators who targeted the youth market, such as Walt Disney, of course, as well as stop-motion pioneer Ray Harryhausen. In fact, the chart I showed you a few moments ago gives a skewed picture of Hollywood history, since it's not adjusted for inflation. Here are the inflation-adjusted numbers for the all-time domestic box office grossers. So you could see a couple of fantasy films here, such as Snow White, but overall, fantasy is only minimally represented. It's not just Hollywood that held fantasy in such low regard. Academia as well has had little interest in the genre. While the 1980s and 1990s saw a flood of scholarly work on science fiction film, even today there remains surprisingly little written on the fantasy genre. And while visionary science fiction films such as Metropolis, 2001, and Blade Runner have entered the film canon, the closest fantasy comes as The Wizard of Oz, which, while appreciated, still has to sit at the kiddie table in most critical accounts. If the fantasy genre was hardly money in the bank, the directors chosen to helm the first Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter movies were no sure things either. New Zealand filmmaker Peter Jackson had pitched his treatment of Lord of the Rings throughout Hollywood for years without takers. That's not too surprising, since his only previous Hollywood project, a comedy horror hybrid called The Frighteners. Oh, darn, I'm sorry. Let's just cut ahead to The Frighteners here. Well, we'll cut ahead to Jar Jar and move from there. Can't get enough Jar Jar. There we go. The Frighteners had managed only $16 million at the box office in the US. Harry Potter director Chris Columbus was best known for directing kiddie comedies such as Home Alone. Christmas of 2001 was a clear turning point. Since then, fantasy has exploded into popular consciousness as never before. In addition to all the sequels of Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, Pirates of the Caribbean and Shrek and the Chronicles of Narnia have all emerged as lucrative fantasy franchises, and I promise you plenty more are on the way for as long as the gravy train keeps running. The fantasy boom is not just a film phenomenon, though. While Hollywood has busied itself adapting the fantasy classics of the 20th century, new writers such as Susanna Clarke, Neil Gaiman, China Miéville, and Philip Pullman have stolen the cyberpunk's thunder, making fantasy today's most exciting and innovative literary genre. So all this leads to one big question: why? Why has fantasy suddenly emerged as this new millennium's preeminent genre, taking on the stature held in the past, I would argue, by the musical in the 1930s, the Western in the 1950s, and science fiction in the 1980s? In turn, as we begin to try to answer this question, we can also start to ask another, even more important question. What does it mean? What are the possible consequences of these stories that we've been telling ourselves? What are the politics of magic today? Let's try to begin to answer these questions by looking at some of the explanations that have been offered so far for the fantasy boom. As you may guess, I think they're insufficient to tell the whole story, but they're a start. First, the technological determinist argument. Over the past 2 decades, Hollywood special effects have undergone a revolutionary shift as advances in computer processing power have made it possible for filmmakers to largely replace traditional techniques such as model building and stop-motion animation with computer-generated imagery, or CGI for short. This new technology, the argument goes, offers an unprecedented level of verisimilitude, allowing directors to create impossible landscapes. And I'm sorry for the blurriness here, but this is, of course, a poster version of that great shot where they're rolling down the... Oh, darn. I'm a Tolkien fan, but I can't remember. What's the name of the river they're riding down? And thank you. I knew somebody would know. And those are the boggling enormous statues on either side. As well as spectacular battles and, of course, inhuman characters, all of which can be blended seamlessly into the footage of real actors who've been shot on physical sets. Peter Jackson, for one, has made the case that only with the development of CGI has it even become possible to successfully adapt novels like The Lord of the Rings. Bakshi's attempt, using what was available to him in 1978 by this logic, was doomed for the start. And now that Hollywood finally has the tools to do justice to the fantasy classics, it's making up for lost time, motoring its way as fast as it can through the works of Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and J.K. Rowling, as well as their many imitators. This argument, which you see all the time in both the mainstream media and fantasy fanzines, has become a kind of common sense explanation for the fantasy boom. And of course it makes a lot of sense, but it leaves a number of questions still unanswered. First off, it doesn't in itself explain the cultural shift from science fiction in the 90s to fantasy in this decade. Science fiction, of course,